Hey girl, hey! Megan here, founder of Leathercraft Ladies, and today's topic, Leather 101. Now we're gonna start out with the sides of the hide, then we'll jump into the parts of a hide and the features of each. We're gonna follow that up with the most common Tannish types, then we'll jump into the grades and different types of leather, and we'll wrap it all up with some key beginner level vocabulary terms that you just gotta know. Now, that seems like a lot, right? But don't stress, I'll walk with you through every step of the way. But you've gotta have the workbook that accompanies this video, okay? You don't have the workbook? You really need the workbook. So if you don't have it, pause the video, go to our website, leathercraftladies.com, download the video or the workbook, and then come right back here. I'll wait. I'm waiting. Okay, you got the workbook? Great. Come on, let's get started.
Now in a few minutes, we'll take an up-close look at some actual leather samples, but for now, we're going to begin in the workbook. So turn with me to page 1. We're going to start at the ground level. What is leather? Now, leather is a natural material created by tanning raw skin. As you can imagine, raw animal skin gets a bit unsavory after a while, and the tanning process makes the skin less susceptible to decomposition and provides us with a natural leather that we can use for a wide range of applications. Now, you'll often hear the terms hide and skin. What's the difference? Well, generally a hide refers to large animals such as cow, buffalo, and horses, whereas the term skin refers to smaller animals such as sheep, alligator, and rabbits. Okay, now that we know the difference between a hide and a skin, let's take a look at the different sides to a hide. Now, leather has a top and a bottom, or in the leathercraft community, more commonly referred to as the grain and the flesh side. Now, the grain is the top side of the hide. It's the smoothest and closest to where the hair would have been. Let's take a look at a few examples. This piece of leather here, this is the grain side. That's the top side, and again, it's typically the smoothest. On this side, this here would be the grain side. That's the top grain side, again, usually the smoothest of the two. And one more example. Here is the grain side on this sample. Now, in contrast to that, we also have the flesh side. That is the bottom or the underneath side of the leather that's closest to where the meat of the animal would have been. And this is usually the roughest side of the leather. All right, let's take a look again. So this was the grain side. This is the flesh side. Can you see how that's a little bit rougher? This example will be a little bit more prominent. Here's the grain, the smooth side. And this is the underneath or the flesh side. Again, the side that's closest to where the meat of the animal would have been. Grain side, flesh side. Top, this is the grain, underneath, or the flesh side. Okay, so that is the two sides of a hide. What was this again? Yep, you got it, the grain. On the underneath side, the flesh. All right, looks like you've got that covered. Now we'll move on to the parts of a hide. Now for this next section, I'll be using this diagram, but be sure to follow along in your notes section and label the parts of the hide as we move through them here. In the USA, cowhide is the most common leather that you'll run into, and this here is a rough sketch of the typical shape of a full or a whole hide of leather. Now, we'll just use this diagram for the next few minutes to get familiar with the common parts, and then I'll show you an actual side of leather so you can see how it translates. First, we're going to start with the belly. There's the belly on that side, and one on this side here. Now, the belly has a very loose fiber structure, and that makes it the softest and the most stretchy part of the hide. Take a look at this piece here that's from the belly of a hide. Look at how stretchy that is. See that move? Super stretchy is the belly. I mean, just think about how much our belly skin can stretch. And the hide skin is exactly the same. Now we're going to move on next here to the bend. This is a bend, and this is a bend. And the bend has the tightest fiber structure of the hide, which makes it the strongest. So we've got the belly with the loosest, and then the bend has the strongest fiber structure. This is often considered the ideal portion of the hide, and it typically is the most costly. Next up, we have the shoulders. One here and one shoulder here. Now, the shoulder fibers are strong, but they may crease easily because this area was affected by the animal's head movement. Again, think shoulders. So it's a really good cut for beginners to start with because it's both strong and budget friendly. And then finally, we have the head and the neck area. Now this area has a medium strength fiber structure. It's stronger than the belly, but looser than the shoulders and the bend. And then if you take a closer look here, two shoulders together we'll call a double shoulder. I mean, that makes sense, right? So one of these orange areas is a shoulder. Two of them together we call a double shoulder. And then the same down here for this area. One of these yellow areas is a bend. You put two of them together, we just call it a double bend. Now, the entire diagram here is referred to as the whole hide. If you take half of that, or what would coincide with this red area here, that would be considered one side. Okay? One side. So one half of the whole hide is a side. And that is a very common cut sold by many tanneries. So if you hear of somebody saying they bought a side of leather, it's typically a half of the whole cow, so to speak, if we're referring to cowhide right here. Now, let's take a look at an actual hide. Okay, friend, now this is an actual side of leather. It is half of the diagram that we just looked at. Now, this particular workbench of mine is 4 foot by 8 foot in length. So that gives you just a rough idea of the size of this particular side. Now, it's difficult for me to get it in the entire side in this shot, but down here, this area would be considered the bend. Okay, think that's like the booty of the cow. Okay, if you're envisioning the actual animal. Along this side is the belly, and remember that is the loosest of the fiber structure. So this area here is pretty stretchy. This area here again is the bend that has the tightest fiber structure. As we move up, this area here is the shoulder area. And then up there at the top is the neck and the head area. Now, if we had an entire full side, we would have basically this same mirrored image over here onto the right. So again, this is half of a full hide, which is considered a side. Now before we move on, this is that same hide, just a closer up look. Let's review. Remember the sides of a hide? We had grain and we had flesh. This is the top of the leather, and that is called, remember, the grain. This here is that same leather on the bottom, underneath side, and remember we call this the flesh side of the leather, the rougher side. Flesh, grain. Okay, you got it. Let's keep moving on. Now that we're finished with page number 1, flip with me over to page number 2, and let's talk Tannish types. Now remember, the tanning process transitions raw animal skin to usable leather. There are many different Tannish types, but there are 2 in particular that are most common today, and that's what we'll be focusing on here. If you're buying leather in North America, it's a safe bet that it's been tanned in one of the following ways. The first Tannish type is a vegetable tan, which is also known as veg tanned. This is a method using natural materials such as water, bark, roots, and leaves. This process can be pretty lengthy, sometimes months or even years. And vegetable tan leather often looks naked when it's purchased due to the lack of pigment and dye. Let's take a look at a few samples. These are natural vegetable tanned leather. As you can see, there's not really any color to any of these particular leathers. These are all samples of natural vegetable tanned or veg tanned leather. One of the positives, however, is even though it comes looking natural like this, you can dye vegetable tan leather any color that you desire. All of these leathers here are actually natural vegetable tan leather that started looking like this and were hand dyed to be the colors that you see here. So that's an option with natural vegetable tanned leather. Also, let's see, here we are. Typically, this type of tannage produces a more stiff leather when compared to other tannages. This is also most known for developing a rich patina over time. Now, one of the characteristics, again, about vegetable tan leather is it typically doesn't have a ton of oils or waxes infused into it. So when you first get it, it is a little more stiff or rigid compared to the next tannage type we'll be talking about in a minute. But it does develop a patina over time. I wanted to show you this. This was actually a piece of natural vegetable tan leather that I had sitting around in my workshop, and I literally had it sitting like this, and I had another piece of leather over top of it like this, and it was sitting there for a few weeks, and then I went to actually get the piece underneath it, and as you can see, it got a suntan. And that's one of the awesome things about vegetable tan leather is it does develop a patina over time. It will get darker based on its use and with the natural waxes and oils from your hands and all the things that come into contact with it. So that's a few characteristics to keep in mind with vegetable tanned leather. Let's jump down to chrome tanned. The next very common tannage type is chrome tanned leather. Now, all of this leather that you see here falls in this category. This has all been chrome tanned. And that is a method using chromium salts. Now, this process can be as short as a few days to complete, which makes it much less expensive than vegetable tanning, and it often involves fusing waxes or oils into the hide, which produces a softer, more flexible leather when compared to vegetable tan leather. And these hides that are chrome tanned are typically dyed during the tanning process. So again, what you see here are all versions of chrome tanned leather, and they've all been dyed during the tanning process. So each one of these looked exactly like this when I received it. So if you are going to purchase a large quantity of leather from a tannery, you may have the flexibility to negotiate the exact color that you want with them, but most leather crafters aren't in that position, so you actually have to buy whatever it is that the tannery makes. So for example, this piece here was exactly this color, looked just like this when I received it. And the same for each of these. So that's also something to keep in mind with chrome tanned leather. There's also one more category that I want to touch on briefly, and that is hair on hides. Now, this is a separate category, and basically that just means a hide where the hair has not yet been removed. Here are a few samples of some hair on hide rabbit skins. Those are what those look like underneath, and these were actually hand tanned. But I just wanted you to get a chance to see that some people do choose to work with what they call hair on hides, and that just means that the natural hairs are still there. And remember, we would call these skins because they're from the skin of a smaller animal. Remember that? A skin versus a hide. Hair on hides.
Now that you're familiar with the two most common tannage types, vegetable tanned and chrome tanned, let's chat for a minute about when you would and wouldn't want to use each type. Now, as the title says, these are general guidelines, but we've got to start somewhere. So let's jump in.
Now remember, all of these are examples of chrome tanned leather, and that's best for anything soft, such as supple bags, clothing, furniture, or things of that nature. Now, if you want the item to feel fairly soft and supple right away, then chrome tan leather is your best bet. The more oils and waxes that are added during the tanning process, the more soft and flexible the leather will be. So although most chrome tans do have some level of waxes and oils added, they come in a variety of levels. For example, this one here is very, very heavily oiled, and so consequently, it's super buttery to the touch. Whereas this one here, although it's flexible, it doesn't have nearly as many oils and waxes as this first one. I'll show you an example of a bag that I made using two different types of chrome tan leather. So for example, this whole bag was made, the body from chrome tanned leather, but the top portion of leather is much more heavily oiled and consequently much more flexible than the bottom. This is also chrome tan leather, but it doesn't have as many waxes and oils, and so it's a little bit stiffer. So you do need to keep that in mind when you're selecting things, but this just goes to show what a wide variety of leathers can be produced through the chrome tanning process. If you do get a leather that has a lot of oil on it, you may want to keep in mind that you could get some transfer. For example, you may not be able to see here, but this is a piece of paper, and it was actually up next to this piece of heavily oiled leather, and you can see that there was some oil transfer from the leather onto the paper. So that's also something that you want to keep in mind if the leather is heavily oiled. Another thing to keep in mind concerning chrome tan leather is chromium salts may react with metal over time. So it's not advised to use chrome tanned leather, this type of leather, with gun holsters, as gun holsters or knife sheaths or things that are going to be in contact with metal for long periods of time. And what about vegetable tan leather? When would we prefer to use this type of tannage? Well, it's best for anything that you are looking to make that needs to be firm, stiff, or needs to hold its shape, such as belts, saddles, holsters, sheaths. Those are really great items to use vegetable tan leather for. It's also best for anything that needs to be stamped or tooled, as vegetable tan leather is tanned to hold cold stamping and tooled images. Now remember, vegetable tan leather can initially be more stiff than the chrome tan, but if you're willing to use it and allow it to break in over time, it will transform and develop character based on your use and can really be a gorgeous leather over time. And there are several things that honestly could go either way. Bracelets, wallets, books, journal covers. Depending on the design needs and personal preference, That's what's going to help dictate whether you want to use chrome tan or vegetable tanned. So let's take a look at a few items that have different designs but are done with either chrome and or vegetable tan. So for example, these all here are notebook covers. This one is done in a chrome tanned leather, all chrome tanned. This one here is done in a natural vegetable tan. See, it's got a little suntan here. Natural veg tanned leather. And then this one here is actually a mixture of both. The body of the journal is a chrome tanned leather, but then this little nameplate here was natural vegetable tan. It started out this color, and then it was hand dyed this color. So this is an example of actually mixing, I should say, different tannages in the same item. And then here's an example of a couple different wallets, different designs obviously, but they're both wallets. And this one is done in a chrome tanned leather. This one here is done in vegetable tanned leather. Now that we've got the tannages out of the way, let's move on to the types of leather. Now, I've blown up this diagram that is in your workbook, so we can take a closer view of it. And I will show you examples of each type of leather as we move through. But a quick refresher, this is basically a cross section of leather. Just think like if we cut it right in half. Up here at the top is the grain. Remember, that's the top side of the leather. And then down here, the bottom represents the underneath side or the flesh side. So what we're looking at here is a cross section of it, everything in between the grain and the flesh. The very top portion here that includes the grain and this upper part of the leather closest to the grain is called full grain. And basically what that means is that the entire grain is intact. And it typically does, because of that, include blemishes and some imperfections. That's because nothing with respect to full grain leather has been altered. It's oftentimes the most expensive because of its durability and longevity, and it's very strong. Again, remember, it's closer to the grain, so you've got the tightest fiber structures up here in full grain leather. Now let's take a look at just one example of full grain leather. What you might expect. Now this is a chrome tanned example of full grain leather, but nothing has been altered, so you're gonna get all of the aspects of the hide showing through. You'll see in this particular hide, you've got a brand mark from the ranch where the cattle was. You also can see maybe some nicks from the skin. You're seeing all different aspects of the hide show through in full grain leather. And some people like that and some people don't. It is very strong, but it does have a tendency, like I said, you're going to see, there you go. You can see the blemishes and some imperfections along with it. Now the next level down, we have top grain. And that is very similar to full grain, but the actual top has been sanded away to make the grain more uniform. So essentially it's almost all the full grain where they just sand off the top part. So it removes some of those blemishes. I like to think of top grain, ladies, as kind of like your skin after a good exfoliation. Okay, you're still going to be able to see everything, all of your freckles, if you've got freckles, if you have some age spots, those will still show through, but after exfoliating, it kind of gets rid of some of the dead skin cells and a little bit of that extra stuff that maybe has been hanging around over the years. Let's take a look at a few examples of top grain. So this is top grain leather, and again, you can see still here that you're able to see, this is another example that has a brand on it. Not all samples have brands, but this one does. I wanted to show you that because even though this is top grain and the top has been kind of sanded and buffed away, you're still able to see some of the imperfections, but it does look, if you'll notice, it's a little bit more uniform than the last sample that was full grain. So that's a top grain. And then here's another sample of top grain. This is actually a chrome tan. You're still able to see some of the wrinkles, some of the fat wrinkles show through, but you don't see as many blemishes as you did on that first full grain sample. It's a little bit more uniform. So top grain is nice for those who still want a really strong, durable leather, but aren't a huge fan of blemishes. Then we're moving down here to the next category, which is entailed by the bottom part of the leather being split away from the grain. So essentially, after they take the full grain and the top grain away, so this is all gone, then what they're left with is what we call splits. Often this area of the leather or of the hide is called a genuine leather, or suede. Also comes from this section of the leather. Again, it's the bottom part of the leather split away from the grain. Now, this is often a lower quality in terms of durability and how it wears over time. Because as you can notice here, the fiber structure is a little bit looser, actually considerably looser than the full and the top grain. So over time, these leathers don't always wear as well as the top and the full grain leathers do. Now, because there are a lot of leathers that come out of this section, there are many terms that are used for various types of splits. Like I said, genuine leather, corrected leather, embossed leather, suede. So you'll hear a lot of terms for leather that comes from this cross section of the hide. I'm going to show you just a few examples. This is an example of a split with a corrected grain. Do you see how perfect this looks? It looks kind of like, how should I say, maybe like an airbrushed Instagram picture, like a filter that makes everything look perfect. So if you see leather that looks like this, 9 times out of 10, it's what they call corrected grain, meaning it has been embossed or imprinted upon to actually give it this look. That this is not actually a natural characteristic. This is a split that has a corrected grain. So this is an example of something that comes from that split section of the leather. This here is actually also a split with a buffed grain. You know, you can't feel it, but this is very soft, and it does kind of feel like you're not going to feel any stubble or anything on it. It's a nice, what they call a buffed grain. And it has kind of a velvety feel. This is another example of a split that has a buffed grain. And then this here is a suede. And this is another type that comes from the split section. If you felt this, you would feel it's kind of hard on a suede to tell what is the grain and what is the flesh, because they both feel very, very similar in terms, because it is kind of coming from that middle section there, okay? So that's where your suede comes from. And then this is another example of a corrected grain. See exactly how kind of uniform that looks? That's a corrected grain, and you can't feel it over the video, but it feels really kind of plasticky, this particular one. Now that one is the flesh side. There's the grain, but it just feels a little more plastic than the higher quality top grain and full grain. Now, not all leathers that are splits are low quality. In this section of the leather, there's a wide range of quality of leather. So, but it's just important to know, especially when you hear that word genuine leather, that can be a bit tricky, and it's a marketing technique that many places use. It doesn't always mean that it's a high quality leather. So we'll do a different video on a different day on genuine leathers. But just know that in this area, we call that the split, and that's taken away from the full and the top grain portion of leather. And finally, we have bonded leather. Now, this is by far the most affordable, and that's because it's made from the scraps and leather dust. After all of this leather is gone, we've taken the full, the grain, the top grain, the splits, all that's gone. Everything that's left over on the floor, the dust, the little extra bits of leftover leather, they take all of that and glue it to a filler background, to a filler backing. And that's where we get bonded leather. It's often called blended or reconstituted leather. That's a few other terms that are often used for it. But here's how I like to remember it. When you think bonded leather, think chicken nuggets. Because essentially, chicken nuggets are to chicken like bonded leather is to leather. Is that chicken? I mean, technically, yeah. Technically, it's chicken. It's all the leftover little bits of chicken that nobody wanted. And they put it together and kind of fuse it together in this little fried crust. Well, bonded leather is kind of similar. You're taking all the leftover pieces, not of chicken, but of leather, and gluing it, pasting it, affixing it in some fashion to a leather backing, to like a paper cloth backing. This is one example of bonded leather. And I'm willing to bet that you've seen this before. Now, this particular leather looks like this. After just a few times of rubbing my fingernail against it, you can see that it's essentially just peeling away. This little metallic leather on top easily just peels away from this kind of cloth type backing that it's stuck onto. Okay, now technically, is this leather? Well, yeah, I mean, technically it is. There's leather bits and pieces in here. It's just not going to be a high quality piece over time. If you've bought something that is this type of leather in the store, and especially ladies, if you get purses, over time you notice that like where kind of it's creased starts to wear away, and then you'll see a little something that looks very similar to that, and your leather just starts to kind of peel away. Well, that's because it's some form of a bonded or reconstituted leather. It is leather. It's just not the high quality. It's whatever was left kind of on the cutting room floor, so to speak, and they didn't want to waste it, which I commend them for. They didn't want to waste it, so they turned it into bonded leather. So you just need to understand, it's not that this is horrible to use, it's just, it's important for us to understand when we're comparing leather, what it is we're actually looking at, okay? So you might not necessarily want to use bonded leather if your goal is to create something that's a high quality item that you're going to want to carry and have for a long, long time, right? So it's really important to understand these different types of leather, so that number one, if you're purchasing leather, you can compare apples to apples. And if you are going to be creating leather products, it's important for you to understand what type of leather you're working with so you can communicate accurately and effectively to your customers. If you're using a bonded leather, do not try to tell people it's a full grain leather or a split or anything else. Just make sure that you understand what it is you're buying and selling.
Hey girl, you're doing great. Stick with me, we're in the home stretch. But listen, tell me, have you ever traveled to another country or maybe visited a different city and you felt like a complete tourist because you didn't know their lingo? Well listen, the Leathercraft community definitely has its own lingo. Now we're not going to tackle the whole language today, but we will touch on a few key vocabulary terms that will help you make sure that you don't look or sound like a Leathercraft tourist.
The first vocab term we'll tackle is weight. Now, weight refers to the thickness of the leather, and it's usually measured in ounces. 2 to 3 ounces is a very thin leather, and 15 to 6 ounces, in contrast, is a pretty thick leather. Now, if you're buying a large piece of leather, like a whole side or a whole hide, They may display the range of weights in a range, for example, 5 to 6 ounces or 10 to 12 ounces. And that's because some portions of the hide may be a 5 ounce and some may be a 6 ounce. Let's take a look at a few different samples of leather in. Now this piece here on the bottom is clearly thicker than the one on the top, okay? And remember, weight has to do with the thickness of leather. This piece up here is about a 3 to 4 ounce leather, whereas this piece down here is closer to like an 11 or 12 ounce leather. So the higher the number for the weight relative to weight, the thicker the leather. Smaller the ounces, the thinner the leather. Just remember, weight refers to the thickness of the leather. And choosing the appropriate weight leather is a very important step in designing and constructing your leather goods. But that's a whole thing in and of itself. Another video for another day. Next up is temper. Now this doesn't have to do with how angry the cow is. It actually refers to the flexibility of a leather. Soft temper refers to fairly flexible leather, whereas a firm temper refers to a more stiff or rigid leather. Let's take a look. This here would be an example of a leather with a very soft temper. Do you see how easy it is for me literally to just ball this up? This is super flexible and would be considered a leather with a soft temper. This, on the other hand, is a more medium temper. Not super firm, but it's not easy for me just to wad this up into a ball like the other one. So again, temper has to do with the flexibility of a leather. Next, we have pull-up. Now this is a characteristic of some chrome tan leathers where the waxes and oils shift when the leather is bent, and that allows for a lighter color to emerge at the bend. Let's take a look at a few examples. Now here we have two leathers that have a decent amount of pull-up. What happens here is you can already see some visual variation in the colors, but watch what happens when I bend this. Do you notice here how the lighter color kind of emerges? That's called pull-up. Again, it has to do with leathers that have oils and waxes, and it's when the oils and waxes are displaced at the location of the bend, and it allows for some color variation to occur at that location. What I'm going to do is rub my finger underneath the flesh side of this leather, and this also has some pull-up effect. Watch what happens. Now, not all leathers have a pull-up as a characteristic, but some do. And this is either one of those things that people tend to like or not. It's a personal preference, but it's important for you to understand. So if you're looking to buy a leather and it says that it has a high level of pull-up or high degree of a pull-up effect, that's what they're talking about. If you've seen any leather goods that have personalization on them, such as initials, a monogram, or text, or even an image in the leather, that's typically done one of two ways. Stamping, either cold stamping or hot stamping. Now, stamping is the process of pressing a letter or image into the leather. Now, cold stamping involves no heat at all and can be done only on vegetable tanned leather, whereas hot stamping, or sometimes called branding, involves a high degree of heat, and that can be done on both vegetable and chrome tan leathers, because essentially hot stamping is burning the top layer of leather. So let's take a look at a few examples that were done both cold stamping and hot stamping, just to give you an idea of the difference of the two. Remember, as we discussed earlier, cold stamping can only be done on vegetable tanned leather. So anytime you see things like this, preset shapes that have been stamped into leather, or letters that have actually been cold stamped into leather, or even images that have been carved or what we call tooled into leather. That can only be done through a process of cold stamping on vegetable tanned leather. Here's another example on some bridal leather stamped in there. Anything like this, remember, these all started out as undyed vegetable tan leather, but stamps like this need to be done on vegetable tan leather. Can you do it on chrome tan? You can try, but it's probably not going to look as clear and crisp, and certainly won't hold up over time as it will on vegetable tan leather. So that's cold stamping. You only really want to do that on vegetable tanned leather. But what if you have chrome tan leather and you're looking to add some sort of a personalization or text to it? That can be done. This here is an example of hot stamping. And hot stamping, again, uses a high degree of heat, and it can be done both on vegetable tanned and chrome tanned leather. Now this here started out as natural veg tan leather that was then hand dyed, but what you see here is actually, again, vegetable tanned and chrome tan. It's the same thing. Both have been hot stamped into the leather. And again, what this does is essentially just burns the top layer of the leather. So you can pretty much do this on most leather. You always want to test it out because all leather is tanned uniquely. And so different leather takes hot branding better than others, but it is possible to do. So these are samples of hot branding that was done both on vegetable tan and on chrome tanned leather. Typically, however, when you do this, if you decide to do this, you need to get a custom stamp made because, again, it does involve a high degree of heat, and you've got to have some special tools and things to make that happen. But it is a possibility. So again, hot branding can be done both vegetable tan and chrome tan. Cold stamping, you want to stick with just vegetable tan for that. Well, we finished the workbook, but let's wrap it up by pulling all that information together and take a closer look at a few samples and describe some of these leathers using what we've learned today. Now, this one here is a full grain leather. It has a brand mark on it. It is a 5-ounce leather. Remember, that has to do with the thickness. It's chrome tanned. And if we turn it over, we can look and see it has a pretty tight flesh on it. That means there's not a lot of nap to the flesh. Okay, so that would be how we would describe this particular sample of leather. Let's move on to another one. This one here is natural vegetable tanned leather. This one is top grain. It's 7-ounce leather, has a soft temper, and if I turn it over, I would say that it has a pretty loose flesh. Look at how nappy that flesh is. So that's loose flesh. Let's take a look at this one. How would we describe this one here? This is a split leather with an embossed grain. What about the temper? Yep, this is a pretty soft temper. And I've measured this before, so I do know that this is a 3-ounce leather. And it has a fairly tight flesh, a little nappy, kind of in the middle there. And that, again, that's a chrome tanned leather. Let's do one more. Finally here, a smaller piece, but this is a chrome tanned leather. And remember, that means it's also dyed during the tanning process, so it came to us looking like this. This is, again, I've measured this one. This is a 3 to 4 ounce leather. It has a kind of a medium temper, not as easy to kind of bend this, even though it's a fairly thin leather. And this has a buffed grain. It is a split cut.
Well, friends, that wraps up our Leather 101 No Fluff Beginner's Guide. I hope that you feel more educated on the basics and in turn more comfortable the next time that you go to shop for finished leather goods or for leather to make your own creations. Now, if you're interested in any additional leathercraft related topics, be sure to let us know and we'll see if we can help. In the meantime, don't forget to connect with our community of Leathercraft Ladies on Instagram and in our private Facebook group. Thanks for hanging out with me today. And until next time, keep striving to make your leathercraft dreams come true.